listener production.
One of the unsung roles in any police force is surveillance.
Electronic surveillance is technically what we were doing. Constitutes listening devices, tracking devices, those sorts of things.
Hours, weeks, months, even years of surveillance can lead to putting criminals behind bars, and it can critically stop crimes being committed.
It's quite a high reward, high stress area. There's a lot of pressure on you to get it right the first time because obviously if you get caught or the suspect finds the equipment, you've failed and that could potentially blow the whole case.
Andrew Atkinson spent 28 years with Victoria Police and was also deployed 3 times as a peacekeeper for the United Nations, twice in East Timor and once in Iraq.
I had to drive from Baghdad to Amman in Jordan, which is about a 1,300 kilometre trip, right through places like Fallujah and all these other places where there was really significant conflict happening.
He wrote a book about his career, Copper, A Life in Law Enforcement.
One of the first jobs I ever went to after graduating was a triple fatal. As a 20-year-old or 21-year-old, it was interesting, it was wow, and you don't understand that that has an impact on you.
He began his career in general duties when Victoria was entering a period renowned for gangland warfare and an underbelly of crime. I'm former police officer Brent Sanders, and for the past 25 years, I've dedicated myself to sharing what I've learnt on the force to the Australian public so they can better protect themselves from falling victim to crime. So with the help of some of the most respected current and former detectives and high-ranking law enforcement agents, we're going to pull back the curtain on what life is like on the force and what they've learned about how crime and criminals really work. These are real stories from real detectives. Andrew, you joined Victoria Police or graduated from the academy around about 1991. Now, anybody who's lived in Victoria, even beyond, knows that this was a time where Melbourne was experiencing comparatively quite a high degree of underworld activity, gangland wars, this type of thing. Very colourful characters, as they're often depicted. Jason Moran, the Carl Williams, these type of guys. These became household names, these individuals in Victoria and beyond. Can you talk to us about working general duties in the police at that time? No doubt you'd have been rubbing shoulders with some of these characters.
Yeah, I joined, as you say, in 91, grew up in the country, always respected authority. Policing wasn't at the forefront of my mind, but I sort of, my uncle was a policeman, so it was always there. And I joined and I don't regret joining at all. I actually really enjoyed my job, loved every aspect of it. Started out general duties did a lot of work in the metropolitan area around St Kilda, Paran, inner city Melbourne. Was obviously exposed to a lot of those crime elements that were happening in and around that time. The underworld stuff sort of didn't really kick off until a bit later. And about 1998, it really sort of kicked off. In that time, I was working at Paran on one occasion, and I went after work. We went down for a few drinks down at a bar called Bennigan's, which used to be in Chapel Street, the infamous Chapel Street in Paran. I was at the bar, went up to the bar, bought a round of drinks for the people I was with, walking back to the bar, and a fellow sort of was walking backwards talking to his group of people, and he backed into me and knocked all my drinks over. And there was a little bit of a confrontational, episode there, and it's like, you owe me 4 drinks sort of thing. And he said, I'm not buying your drinks, and da-da-da. Anyway, I went back, bought some more drinks, went back to my table, and one of his friends came up to me and said, is everything cool? Is everything okay, And I said, yeah, look, he owes me 4 drinks, but I'm not going to get into anything about it. And he goes, Jason's sort of not going to do anything with it as well. And I said, who? And he goes, Jason, that's Jason. I said, Jason who? He said, it's Jason Moran. And then it twigged. Jason became quite infamous later on in his young life and was actually murdered a few years later. He was one of the big major players in the big gangland issues that were happening in the following years.
Interesting also, could I say, mate, that you've got Victorian coppers drinking in the same watering hole as some key figures of local gang and underworld families.
Yeah. Paran was a little bit different like that because there were so many bars and clubs and whatever in and around that area. You used to go to what was popular. And of course, those underworld characters, they used to go to what was popular as well. And Bennigan's was a popular bar at the time, and it's no longer there. But yeah, we used to go and drink there. And, it's one of those things, you never know who else is in your backyard. So, yeah.
And also, mate, we've all been young coppers, and you go out and have a couple of beers with guys and stuff. And at that time, the likes of Moran, Williams, they would have been names known probably to police as being part of these, well, certainly Moran, part of a crime family, but they didn't quite have the infamy that they do now, almost sort of retrospectively looking back. You mentioned a name like Carl Williams in a pub in Western Australia, and people are going to go, oh, that's that crook from Melbourne.
Yeah.
But back then, having a few beers, it was probably more like, oh, yeah, I've heard of him. He's got a bit of a reputation, but it wouldn't have been something that left you lying awake at night, I wouldn't imagine. But interesting how things evolve.
Yeah, the name was familiar because we certainly had briefings that they were in the area and they used to come and, they were regulars in the area. So we knew they were on the police radar. Certainly. But as a general duties, copper working the div van, it wasn't something that you think you're going to come across. Your thoughts are, well, going to domestics or going to whatever the community call in for, not for organised crime and that sort of stuff. So it wasn't really something that sort of played on your mind, yeah.
It's interesting too, isn't it, mate? And again, when you're working general duties, you're not typically going to be assigned to any sort of investigation or long-term work with any figures like a Moran or something like that. Your interaction with them is almost spur of the moment. You might tip a car over, you might do a QVR on a rego or something, pull them up and suddenly realise, oh, hang on, we've got a carload full of Carl Williams and others here. So it's more opportunist, isn't it? And then you pass that information through to the powers that be, and those that work in that more sort of gang-orientated style of the police, they'll pick that intelligence up and move forward on it.
Yeah, so as you say, it's opportunistic. You might pull a car over and Jason Moran's driving or he's in the passenger seat or whatever, and you on the van, your obligation is to put in an information report, which then works its way up to those investigating those people to say that this is where they were at this particular time, and that's pretty much your involvement.
Carl Williams, did you have a crossing over with Carl Williams involving a vehicle or something? Did I recall that correctly? Was there something?
Yeah, I did. That was later on. That was really at the height of the underworld sort of stuff. I was working at in a specialist area at the time, technical surveillance unit. We were tasked to put a listening and tracking device in Carl's car. So we spent quite a bit of time, following Carl around to find the best opportunity to get access to his motor vehicle. And one particular day he parked in the city, up in Elizabeth Street, I think it was, or Lonsdale Street. And he's walked around the corner to a restaurant. He's gone in and sat down at the table. So we thought, great, we've got an opportunity here. Pinched his car and did what we needed to do from a technical perspective. And then we got the word that he was leaving the restaurant. So I've jumped in his car and driven it back to where we grabbed it from. He was walking pretty quickly back to his car and it was a bit time sensitive, so I ended up going through a few red lights in his car and whatever. And as I was driving back, I'm thinking, geez, if I get pulled over here and I'm in Carl Williams's car, I've just gone through some red lights and I don't have any ID on me. I don't know how I'm going to go here. But I managed to get the car back in time and then jumped out and then sort of walked away just as Carl sort of got back to his car, none the wiser. And then I was worried that I'd, adjusted his seat and, adjusted his mirror. And did I do any of those things? No, I didn't. I think I'm right there. So all those things go through your mind after you've been in someone's car. And because, you pick up on those things. If you hop in your car and your seat's not right, you sort of think, what's going on here?
Well, especially these boys, mate, they are so paranoid of
absolutely.
Police involvement. They're living life on the edge, these blokes. They all know it's only a matter of time before they're going to get locked up. So it's...
yeah.
And, mate, we don't have to go into too much detail, but was it worth the effort?
Yeah, it was. It was very beneficial. So that worked out quite well for us. When we do things like, break into houses or steal cars or whatever, it's not just carte blanche. You just don't go away and do it. You do need lots of authorities and you need a Supreme Court warrant to be able to do that. So it's not like you're just picking a car off the side of the street and go, oh, let's go and put a tracking device in this. It's a lot more detailed than that. But those people are very much paranoid.
And just refresh my memory, Jason Moran, no longer with us. He was taken out by, I think, you'll know better than me, was he eventually taken out by other gangland figures down there in Victoria?
Yeah. I get them mixed up. There's Mark Moran and Jason Moran, and I can't recall. One of them was shot after his son's football, Auskick or whatever they call it, with other kids in the car. So him and his bodyguard were both shot in the car. And the other one, I think, was Jason was shot out the front of his house. I think he was taking his rubbish bin out. Someone's popped out from behind the bushes and ended his life.
Yeah, better live by the sword, die by the sword, I guess, in that regard. And Carl Williams, is he still with us, Carl Williams?
No, Carl was murdered in prison. I think they ended up tagging him for 7 murders. So in theory, he's a serial killer. He mightn't have done them by his own hand, but he was certainly behind them. And he was taken out by a fellow prisoner when he was in protective custody in prison, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like a long time ago, but then when you hear these recollections, I clearly remember the report of Moran being literally assassinated, sitting in his car alongside the footy field where his kids were playing a bit of footy. Goodness me, Carl Williams, 7 suspected, 7 murders. No wonder you're a bit jittery, mate, racing through those red lights trying to get his car back before he got back to the car park.
Yeah. I actually went to Carl's funeral, and not because I was there to mourn his death. I actually went from a surveillance gathering perspective. And what was really interesting was when they were when someone was giving his eulogy, they said he was a rascally fella. And I thought, yeah, that's one way of putting it, I suppose.
Yes. I mean, there's drawing a longbow. What's the opposite to drawing a longbow? I don't know. But
yeah, he's a bit of a scallywag, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's giving him the benefit of the doubt big time, mate, isn't it?
Well, that's true, yeah. Mm.
You shouldn't speak ill of the dead, so I suppose maybe that curtailed some of the more accurate descriptions of him, possibly. Andrew, you did about 9 years in general duties there in Melbourne. Then you moved across to the Technical Surveillance Unit, Victoria. This is an area of policing that probably doesn't get the spotlight on it much at all. Can you chat to us about this unit and the nature of the work that you did? I think you were deployed with them for about 16 years.
Yeah, you're right. It doesn't get the spotlight, and that's sort of the way they like it. They like to be, it's a covert role, undercover if you like. We were tasked with electronic surveillance is technically what we were doing. So that's constitutes listening devices, tracking devices, those sorts of things. I didn't really understand what they did before going there. Back when I joined, they're actually called the Technical Support Unit, which sounds like someone who comes and resets your photocopier or something, but it's actually a little bit more high-powered than that. When I went there, I started out in the video crew, effectively, so putting in covert video surveillance, so covert video cameras. Often with covert surveillance, it requires a warrant. Most of the applications of covert surveillance require a warrant, which is issued by the Supreme Court. So they don't hand them out lightly, so they are quite complex. Once we've got the warrant, we'll then go and assess the target area of where you need to go, what we need to do, work out a plan, work out the best time of day or night to go and execute that plan and go and do what we need to do. So whether that's putting a listening device in a house or in a business, putting a tracking or listening device in a vehicle, it is quite convoluted and quite complex. And there's a lot of work goes in the background before you actually deploy your equipment. So I ended up doing 16 years at different ranks off and on. So I left and get promoted and come back and that sort of thing. So I ended up doing 16 years. It's quite a high reward, high stress area. So there's a lot of pressure on you to get it right the first time because obviously if you get caught or the suspect finds the equipment, you've failed and that could potentially blow the whole case. So we would work on request from areas like the homicide squad, the drug squad, or other different work groups within Victoria Police to do whatever it is that they needed done, whether it's a listening device, as I say, or a tracking device, and we would deploy that equipment in support of that operation.
If we look at it, and you don't have to give any trade secrets away, but if you've gone to the Supreme Court, you've put evidence for a justice or a judge to sort of say, well, okay, there's enough evidence here. I can see that this is a necessary use of police resources and what have you. So you would almost go then in a covert way to a home, let's say, gain entry into that home, plant some listening devices within the home, possibly phones or, active devices. Once that's done, Andrew, was it the job of that surveillance unit to monitor that chat, or is that then picked up by, say it's the drug squad that have given you this intelligence that leads to getting the warrant? Once you've planted that surveillance unit, say in that home, who then monitors that? Do you do that, or is that done by those that requested the surveillance? Yeah,
no, that's all managed by the requesting investigation group. So then they're responsible for the monitoring of that information. Our responsibility is with the effectiveness and the proper functioning of the equipment. So we're removed from that listening component, which sort of is good in a lot of ways because it prevents you having to go to court to validate some of that information. We used to occasionally get called to court to try and ask where you put the gear or how you got in and all those sorts of things. And we don't disclose any of that. We claim public interest immunity. So it's in the interest of the public that we don't disclose how we operate. And that's generally accepted, and we move on from there, yeah.
That was going to be my next question. It would be very rare for somebody in that role to have to stand up in court and produce any sort of a brief, I would imagine. And it's certainly not something that prosecution are going to ask for, but you might get the occasional grisly defence counsel that tries to call you in. But you'd be pretty protected, I would imagine, in a courtroom environment by a judge.
Yeah, they don't get far.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, no, they don't get far. But you think about if you were putting a listening device in a residential house, and think about your own house as an example. If strange people turned up to your house, do you think your neighbours would go, "Oh, I saw that you had someone here today," or something? So there's a lot of planning goes into the deployment of gear. It's not like, well, they're off at work, we'll just lob up and do what we do at the house. It's really a lot of background work that goes into the deployment of technology, because you just don't want to blow the case. You don't want the neighbours to go, "Oh, I see you had some people here today," and you go, "No, I didn't. I don't know what you're talking about." And then if you're up to no good, you become suspicious. So there's a lot of planning goes into how we get in, where we put the gear, all that sort of stuff. So it's not as simple as some people may think. It's quite complex.
And those, let's say, listening devices, every case is going to be different, of course, but they could be operated or under operation for quite some length of time. I know from my time in the job, there was situations where suspects of certain high-level crimes were actually under surveillance, video surveillance and otherwise for months, sometimes years, to gather information. So that's not uncommon?
No, that's not uncommon, and you have to factor that in at the start. Often you'll ask the investigator, how long is this going to go for? They'll say 3 months. You always double it because things happen and they blow out, and you have to prepare for that. The powering of your device and all those sorts of things need to be taken into consideration. So, you need to really you don't want to have to go back to fix things or change the battery or whatever. Things have got to be squared away right from the start. Yeah.
And just on that, it's a small thing, but once evidence has been gathered through that surveillance and there's enough for those who are monitoring it to say, right, now we've got enough, we're going to go and make the arrest. You guys, I'd imagine, sweep back through and remove that gear. And is that how that works? Or yeah.
So you just do the reverse. Sometimes it's easy because the person's been arrested, so it's not as complex. But other times, if you don't get enough information or don't get enough evidence, you still got to go and get your gear. So you go back again and do a retrieval, which is a lot quicker than an installation, but you've got to get your gear back.
At this end of the criminal spectrum, Andrew, we're not putting surveillance gear into the home of some lowbrow criminal offender. This is generally high-level crimes committed by those at high levels in the criminal fraternity. They're paranoid, like you say. They think every knock at the door's the coppers. Every person they meet, they don't know's a copper. Were there times, 16 years you're in this field, how often did those surveillance operations, how often did they get sprung by the offenders? Did you have too many where they sussed it, or they started to know that they were being listened to and that started to determine maybe throwing a few red herrings out to the coppers listening? Did that ever occur?
Yeah. Thankfully, it didn't happen as much as what you may think. And basically, that comes down to really good planning. But on the odd occasion, it did happen. And the majority of those times were the occupant or a friend of the occupant comes to the house or the business or whatever while you're there. So you've sort of got to run away effectively, because you still live in hope that the operation hasn't been burnt. So you generally don't declare who you are if you don't have to, unless you're really compromised. So often you'll run away and make it look like you're, another offender who just was there doing some other nefarious activity, whether they were there to do a burglary on the house or, attempting to steal the car or whatever. So you make it look like another offender.
Now, mate, 16 years in that role, and again, you don't have to give away any trade secrets here, but you must have seen in that time, and I'm sure since then, some pretty major advances in technology in techniques around surveillance and things such as that? Because you would have gone into this sort of early 2000s, and here we are now 25 years down the track. It's a time where other areas of advancement, internet, computers and everything else just went from 0 to 100. Was that reflected in this environment that you were working in as well?
Yeah, 100% it was. Yeah. So, the size of the equipment reduces, the quality of the equipment improves. The biggest issue, I suppose, was cost, because you had to try and remain contemporary, but sourcing the money was always difficult when you've got so many different areas of policing all chasing the same money out of the same bucket. So that was always an issue, because it's thousands and thousands of dollars worth of technology that you need to invest in, which they suggest has a life of maybe 8 to 10 years, but the reality is it might be 4 or 5 years before it's obsolete. So that is a big issue. Thankfully, Victoria Police see the value in technical surveillance and are quite supportive of the continual upgrade of technology. But it is a challenge, yeah.
Andrew, with the folks that are working in an environment like this, are they all sworn police, or is this, because, we know now there's roles within the police that when you and I started in the job were all done by police dispatch and everything else, fingerprinting and what have you. A lot of this is now outsourced to civilians who are very, a lot of experience and skill in these areas. This area of surveillance, is it still purely done by sworn police, or is there some outsourcing to civilians?
No, it is sworn police. Because of the legislation that you operate under, you need to be a sworn member to be able to function in that environment. But what Victoria Police do is they have the ability to recruit laterally, so they can recruit someone from the private world into the technical unit. They do academy time, so they do learn the basics of policing and have that foundation. But then they they are inducted into the organisation as a sworn police member and then operate as a operative in that environment. They are limited. They can't leave and go and say, I might go and be a sergeant at St Kilda now because I'm sick of this, but they can't. They've only, because of the training that they've undertaken and their employment conditions, they can only be an operative at the technical unit.
Andrew, it's such an interesting insight, and obviously I'm mindful of taking our discussion too deep, because we never know who's going to be listening into these these chats, and we don't want to give away too many trade secrets. But it's always been such an interesting area, and I know there have been some extremely high-profile cases which have been successfully prosecuted directly because of surveillance and the evidence that's been gathered through that. So it's such an important part of policing.
Yeah, I found it really rewarding. I really enjoyed being part of some of those really bigger jobs and saying that, I had a hand in arresting that fellow. I was, involved in that operation. I found that really rewarding. As I said before, it is high pressure. One of the things that sits at the back of your mind is that if I'm in, say, Carl Williams' house putting a listening device in and he comes home, his first thought is not going to be they're the police. His first thought is going to be that, he's trying to rob me, or he's another criminal who's got it in for me, or whatever. That's a big fear, because the likelihood is it's going to end in a gunfight, and that could be really ugly for a lot of people. So that is a real concern, and that's why, you've really got to get your planning and preparation right before you go and deploy.
Coming up, Andrew's role as a peacekeeper with the United Nations and being stabbed while off duty. Andrew, in the early 2000s, you took up, I think, your first of 3 overseas deployments. You were connected or joined to the Australian Federal Police at that time. You did deployments to both Timor and Iraq. Can you discuss this time that you spent working within, I think it was within the auspice of the United Nations, that you were deployed into these countries?
Yeah, so in 2001, I was seconded to go and work with the Federal Police deployed to East Timor. So back in 2000 or 1999, there was a lot of unrest in East Timor as the Indonesian government withdrew and left the country to effectively defend for themselves. There was a lot of conflict with Indonesia and East Timor as a country at the time. And along with the military, Australia committed police personnel to provide that civilian policing issue. There was 34 different countries all represented in East Timor at the time. which was really, sounds great, but it was really complex in that every country had their own different way of doing things. So that complicated a lot of issues in and around the country. So my role, my first deployment was a 6-month deployment to East Timor. I was originally in the capital city, which is Dili, and lived at the power station and worked as a pretty much right response, if you like. So it was a response team for any civil unrest that might develop during the day or evening, and we would respond to that. Unfortunately, while I was in East Timor, I got stabbed. I was out for a run after work one day, and every other day I'd been for a run, but I'd take my equipment with me, as in my firearm, my baton, my spray. On this particular day, for whatever reason, I left my spray and baton at home, mainly because it was too clunky to run with. I had a bum bag, but it was just awkward and bouncing around, so I ended up leaving it behind. But sure enough, on this day, I got confronted by it turns out to be an Indonesian person who wanted money. I didn't have any money. I was out running. We ended up in a physical altercation. He pulled a knife out and stabbed me once in the forearm and once in the stomach. I sprayed him with my capsicum spray and he ran off the other way. I thought he was running back to his motorbike to chase me, but he actually hopped on his motorbike and took off the other way. I turned and ran back the way that I'd come. I knew there was an Australian Army base back up there, so I ended up running up there. It was about 1 kilometre up there. I've run into the Army base. The security at the front said, "You right?" I said, "Yeah, I've just been assaulted down the road." And they said, "Oh, you're bleeding." And I looked down and there was blood all down my leg from my stomach, which I hadn't noticed. So they threw me in the back of their 4-drive and took me up to the military hospital, which effectively was a tent. I got a Jordanian doctor who stitched me up and sent me home. So I went back to the power station where I was living at the time, which was great because we had power all the time, and regaled everybody with my afternoon's activities. I went to bed. I woke up about 4 a.m. in excruciating pain, went back to the hospital and got an Australian doctor this time, and he said there was internal injuries, which the original doctor hadn't addressed. I had a lot of bleeding into my stomach and all that sort of stuff. I was diagnosed with septicemia, and they wanted to fly me back to Australia for surgery, but didn't think I'd make the flight, survive the flight, so they opted to operate in East Timor, and I recovered and was fine and went back to work. I moved work locations. I moved up to the mountains, a place called Gleno, and worked up there for the remainder of my 6 months deployment. What I didn't realise was the ongoing impact of the stabbing and the effects that that's caused long term, both mentally and physically. When I returned to Australia, I was diagnosed with PTSD, which, like any copper at the time, I was in complete denial. It was one of those things in Victoria Police at the time, you didn't talk about your own mental health. Mainly out of fear of people won't work with me, or I'll lose my job, I won't get promoted, all that sort of thing. So I just didn't accept any of the doctor's recommendations or advice, and just went about my life. In 2004, I was invited to go to Iraq with the United Nations and work as a peacekeeper over there. Went over and did just short of 4 months over there. And then in 2006, there was more civil unrest in East Timor. So because I'd been there previously and knew the lay of the land, I was asked to go back again. It was going to be a 2-week deployment. I ended up staying 6 months. And it was completely different to the first time in that there was a lot of unrest from the local people who were quite happy to see us in 2001 because of we'd helped liberate their country and all that sort of stuff. But then by 2006, not a lot had changed for them in the sense that there was still a lot of unemployment. There was high levels of infant mortality. There was all sorts of issues that just hadn't been addressed. And so they were a little bit anti-us at the time. But we provided that safety and stability in the country, which they desperately needed.
So 2 deployments in Timor and in between up there in Iraq, 2004. That's a turbulent time to be up there, Iraq and the Middle East. What was your role there? I know that your first deployment in East Timor, you're sort of like a right response team. What was the role in Iraq? Was that a different sort of a role?
Yeah, my role in Iraq, originally I was there to provide security to United Nations infrastructure in Iraq. And then when I got there, they changed my role. So they put me as the team leader of the protection team for the finance officer. So I had to look after the United Nations finance officer, whose job it was to sort of go around town and pay all the bills, which was a bit difficult given that I'd never done personal protection before. It was, I didn't know how to do it, but they made me the team leader, and I had about 6 or 7 people that worked for me, and we used to, escort the finance person around town so he could pay all the bills. It was pretty confronting, the violence and just the unknown. There was times when we'd be driving along and all of a sudden we get shot at. There was a time we're going to a building and you could hear this gunfire from way in the distance, and then all of a sudden there's dust coming down in front of us. And we look up and they were actually shooting at us, but it was hitting the parapet of the building we were walking into. So, you just never knew what was going to happen. The unknown was pretty stressful. And then I left when the United Nations decided it was too unsafe for them to be there, so they left at the time. I had to get a vehicle out of the country. I had to drive from Baghdad to Amman in Jordan, which is about a 1,300-kilometre trip, right through places like Fallujah and all these other places where there was really significant conflict happening. So that was a pretty interesting car trip out of the country.
Bearing in mind too, you're up there, Iraq and in Timor, in a civilian capacity. United Nations, 34 countries coming together. These are all, amongst others, police and other personnel. These are not military personnel per se. Now, we could say there's a little bit of a crossover, summer training and things like that, but, driving a car 1,300 kilometres through Fallujah and war-torn Iraq, and so, that's not quite aligned with training that you would have done back in 1991 as a young recruit in the Victorian Police.
No, there was no preparation for that at all. It was a wing and a prayer sort of stuff. Jump in the car and drive to Amman, you'll be right. You sort of got to go with it, otherwise you're sort of left behind. What was interesting though was before we left, we had to go down to the market and buy some firearms to take for the trip. So you go into the market, and I bought an AK-47 for $50 and got to test fire in the market. So just in the market, just let a few rounds go into the air and go, yep, she works, I'll take this one. And that was your protection for the drive to Amman, because the United Nations had left. They'd taken all the weapons and everything that you were issued with them. So they say, well, they're ours, you can't have them. So
I would imagine, Andrew, that the support for people like yourself coming back to Australia, back into, in your case, Victorian Police, would have been non-existent. It's people would be wanting you to regale your stories of, living in the Middle East and stuff, and all that other stuff was sort of like wouldn't have been discussed or dealt with, I wouldn't imagine.
No. There's no support at all. And that's not a criticism of VicPol by any means. It's just
Sure.
That's life.
Yeah.
They actually put a stop to members going to the Middle East not long after I came back. So members were going over there on taking leave without pay and going and doing operations over there for different companies and organisations. And they actually put a stop to it because there's that potential for ongoing mental health issues which the organisation has to bear as opposed to your employer. So I think that's probably the right decision, stopping people going. So,
what rank did you attain? Like, what rank were you at within the job when you were up there doing all this gear?
Oh, it's only a senior constable at these times.
Okay.
Yeah. So it wasn't until I was a senior constable for quite a long time because I enjoyed the work that I was doing and I didn't see the need to seek promotion. So it wasn't until later on that I actually sought promotion. Yeah.
Andrew, you just briefly touched on the impact of the stabbing and physically and mentally. If you're comfortable, Andrew, in talking about it, I know in your book and in other interviews that you've done that early 2000, you were diagnosed with what we would now call a post-traumatic stress diagnosis. Now, you stayed in the job for almost 2 decades after that with that diagnosis hanging over your head. And I'm no doctor, but you were there. I could only imagine that the effects and impact of post-traumatic stress over a 20-year period it's not going to diminish, it's going to increase. I'm just interested in if you're comfortable talking to us about that time, and you had some other health issues bundled into that as well, I understand.
Yeah. So being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, I sort of didn't really understand it or know what it was, got a good handle on it. But what I found, and it sounds ironic, but what helped me was going to work. I got a lot out of going to work, contributing. It sounds cliche, but my whole reason for joining the job was that I wanted to serve the community. I wanted to help. And I got a lot out of still going to work. So that was my panacea, if you like, was going to work. And that made me feel okay. I used to hate holidays, going away, like not being at work, because I wanted to be there and I wanted to be part of it. And my PTSD symptoms would really manifest when I was on leave and couldn't wait to get back to work, which it's a little bit self-destructive, but that's what I found to be best for me. With PTSD, there's a lot of intrusive thoughts, a lot of, you reflect on jobs that you'd done maybe 10 years ago, and that would be a real issue for you. A lot of people that suffer from PTSD, they say, oh, what was the incident that gave you PTSD? Well, for policing, it's not one incident, it's multiple. And that's what happened to me. As I progressed in my career, I got promoted on a number of occasions. I ended up an inspector, so reasonably high up. It's because I didn't let the PTSD get to me to that point, but I was suffering in silence. In 2012, I was diagnosed with central nervous system lymphoma, which presented as a brain tumour. And that was a direct result of being stabbed. And my clinicians would all say that, yes, that's what's caused it, because you had a weakened immune system coupled with stress is what they suspect is the causation factor for this lymphoma. In a strange kind of way, that was really good for me to have that cancer diagnosis, because I could hide my PTSD symptoms behind that. So when I was struggling and couldn't go to work or whatever, that would be, oh, well, he's got that cancer, so that's okay. But it was actually me hiding. I was fine with the cancer. I could manage that. But it was the PTSD that was really getting to me. And I struggled a bit there. But ultimately, that did lead to the end of my career, because I got to that point where the cancer caused what was then called a vascular necrosis. So that's where your bones slowly die because they're not getting blood flow. So as a result of my cancer and getting a vascular necrosis, I've had to have 2 knee replacements, 2 hip replacements and a shoulder replacement, plus metal in my neck, because all my bones are dying effectively. And that's from the chemo. So chemo is a great drug. It saved my life, but it's slowly killing me on the other side. Unfortunately, I've got more surgeries coming up. My other shoulder needs to be replaced now. So it's just a never-ending battle. My kids are happy because they think, great, when Dad dies, we'll be able to cash him in at the recycling place and get a bit of money for him. It's good that they've got that sense of humour, and I instill that in them because, and this sounds cliche too, it does change your perspective on life, but for me, it's about creating memories with my kids.
So there's those obvious physical issues that you're dealing with as a side effect of the large amounts of chemotherapy that you had to undergo. The post-traumatic stress, the mental side of that scarring from, going back now over 2 decades. Have you been able to address that, and where does that sit today?
It's still an issue. I still have, I still have nightmares and things like that, but I've compartmentalised it quite well, and it's manageable. And these things will never leave me, but if I go into a restaurant, I'm very particular where I sit with respect to my back to the door. I don't do that. I need to see what's going on. And those things will never leave me, but that's okay. I can manage that. I get a lot now out of helping other people that have PTSD. So one of the big things that gets me up each day is supporting other police veterans that are now suffering from mental health issues as a result of their careers.
For you, there's that real irony, isn't there, that you were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress as a result of the job and things associated with it. You found that for you personally, staying within the job and keeping active was your best way to ward that off, because when you're away from the job on holiday, maybe too much time to think. There's an irony there too, isn't there? It's and what works for one wouldn't work for another. If I could ask, playing devil's advocate, if you had your time over again with that diagnosis, with the knowledge that we now have, quarter of a century on, would you have done things differently? Would you have reached out further? What would you have done differently?
Really good question, I suppose. There's probably not a lot I would have done differently. I would have certainly had my career again as a policeman. I certainly would have done all that again. Possibly would have sought help when I was first diagnosed. The environment of the day was that you just didn't admit to any mental health issue. It was like that movie Fight Club, And the first rule is you never talk about Fight Club. But mental health in Victoria Police at the time was very much the same. It's changing, thankfully. It's going to take a real cultural shift before it happens, but it is changing and people are more aware of their mental health. So there's some interesting statistics, and one is that the average member of the public is exposed to 5, 6, maybe 7 traumatic events in a lifetime, whether it's the death of a close family member or a victim of a crime or something like that. A policeman is exposed to 1 traumatic event a week during their career, and that really has an impact on them. It's all those things put together that create the mental health issues. It's not just one event; it's a culmination of events. So it makes it a little bit more difficult to treat because it is so many different factors. But my advice to people entering the job now is to always be aware of your mental health and don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. And have your support networks, have your mates and your friends who can help you. So often, I recall one day I was working the divvy van, and I was on night shift, and we got a job, keep a lookout for a car. The husband had been involved in a domestic with his wife. She'd been taken away to a safe shelter, and police were looking for him. And we got a report to say that his car had been seen in this industrial area. So we've driven down there. There's his car parked there. We approach it carefully. He's sitting in the front seat. Just as I look in the front window, he pulls a gun up and shoots himself. Now, you go home and you can't talk about that with your wife because it's just not a dinner time conversation you can have. So you internalise all those things, and those things impact you mentally over time. You just can't share it. So you do develop a black sense of humour with your colleagues. You talk about those things and you have a laugh, and it's not being disrespectful to the person that's killed themselves or anyone else. It's just how you deal with it. But you can't do that at home. So it's important that you have those networks. You need to develop those when you first join the job so that you can share those experiences with people.
You do a lot of work with police veterans. Victoria, I had the pleasure on just a few days ago of doing a podcast chat with Deb Richardson, who's the new CEO. I think she's only taken up the role a couple of months ago. One of the figures that she shared with us it really just puts a spotlight on this. Police Veterans Victoria have about 7,000 members, past police, of which you're one. Just over 30% suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder to some degree. There would not be any other employer in Australia, including, with all due respect, the military, that would have numbers that are that confronting.
Yeah, we call ourselves Police Veterans Victoria. Most people would be familiar with that veteran term being military, but it's actually a generic term that means people that have been in a job for a period of time. So we are veteran police officers. The organisation, Police Veterans Victoria, support those members that leave the job. A lot of people leave the job fine, and it's not until 3, 4, 5 months later that they start to feel they've lost their sense of identity, their sense of community, and they really start to reflect on things that have happened in their career, and they realise that they're diagnosed with PTSD. I would suspect there's probably more than 30% in reality. I think it'd be a lot higher, but people, especially some of the older veterans, they're just in denial or that's how they've lived their life. They don't know any different or whatever. So we're a not-for-profit charity organisation that provide that support for members as they leave the job and transition back into retirement or into civilian life. And so there's a lot of support that we provide through that organisation.
It's interesting too. I mean, we could chat at this at length, Andrew, and I've had the pleasure of having so many serving and past police, sit through these chats. And oftentimes, when we look back over our time in the job, some of the most confronting jobs that we attended, you attend when you're most junior. Fatal car accidents and death notices to parents because their kids are being killed and things. You're often doing that at 19, 20, 21 years of age.
Yeah. I mean, one of the first jobs I ever went to after graduating was a triple fatal. And as a 20-year-old or 21-year-old, that was pretty cool. It was interesting. It was wow. And you don't understand that has an impact on you. You don't realise that. It's not being disrespectful to the people that died or whatever, but it's like, wow, this is what I joined the job for. I want to be able to help these people out. I want to be able to investigate this sort of stuff and stop it from happening and all that sort of stuff. But you don't understand that those things are slowly impacting you. And if you don't do things along the way to address it, it's going to really bite you at some point.
Andrew, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us here today. I want to thank you for your 20 years of service to the good people of Victoria and also Timor and Iraq during your time up there. Yours is a storied career from general duties through to, working with the United Nations, getting to the rank of commissioned officer and inspector. You lost a fair bit of skin along the way there. It's a credit to you that the work that you now do within Police Veterans Victoria and how much you put back into that. And I just want to thank you for your service to that organisation as well. And thanks for taking the time to have a chat to us.
No, I greatly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
My guest was Andrew Atkinson, a former Victorian police officer who also served time in the United Nations peacekeeping forces in East Timor and Iraq. His book is called Copper, A Life in Law Enforcement. Join us next week for another episode of Crime Insiders Forensics. I'm Brent Sanders, with sound design by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.